The smoke curled slowly in the chapel, as if afraid to rise. It clung to the old wood beams like memory, whispering against stone as dawn refused to break. A single clay lamp flickered in the cold, casting long shadows across the floor, where frost clung to the cracks between the tiles. Outside, the world groaned beneath winter's grip, and somewhere beyond the river, wolves were howling, or were they men? A raven shifted on the rafters, its talons scraping gently on the wood. Below, a girl sat cross-legged on the ground. Her hands were dirty, blackened with soot and ash, and her fingers trembled as they moved across the edges of a wooden crucifix. It was cracked, its edges worn smooth by generations of hands. She pressed her thumb to its splintered center as if testing whether it would bleed. Her name was Alarica. She had not spoken in 3 days. Beyond the chapel walls, her people moved like smoke through the forests. Once they had come as raiders, wild-haired men who painted their faces and struck fear into marble hearts. But not now. Now they came in silence. Wrapped in cloaks stiff with snow and stitched animal hides, their breath curling like ghosts in the frozen air. They were not warriors. Not today. Today, they were a people unmade, a tide of loss and hunger crossing the Danube not with steel, but with open hands. The river had frozen late that year. Thick sheets of ice buckled under the weight of carts and sleds as the Gothic tribes crossed, not in triumph, but in desperation. Behind them, their homes burned. Farms torn from the soil by fire, women taken, children slaughtered like livestock in the name of imperial peace. The Roman legions called it discipline. The Goths called it forgetting. Alarica's father had died trying to save a book. Not a sword, not a relic, a book. It held prayers in the old tongue, written in soot and crushed berries by her grandfather's hand. He had buried it beneath a cedar tree when the tax men came. And when they returned with spears and a decree, he ran to dig it up. They nailed him to the village gate, still clutching the damp leather cover, blood staining the pages. Her mother did not scream. She whispered something to the wind and smeared ash across her face. Then they walked. They followed the others, a ragged procession of widows, children, and men too broken to fight, into the wilderness that led toward Rome. The empire loomed beyond the river like a dream half-remembered. Its cities had walls that gleamed like bone. Its soldiers drank wine even in winter. Its gods, carved from marble, smiled down with closed eyes. The Goths had never belonged to that world. But now, they had no other to claim. There was a camp on the southern bank. Tents lashed together with sinew and hope. Fires too small to warm the bones. Food doled out by Roman hands with disgust, the scraps barely enough to keep the smallest from fading. Alarica saw a boy her age bite into frozen bread and lose 3 teeth. No one wept. Hunger left no room for sorrow. The Roman commanders looked on from horseback, wrapped in cloaks lined with fox fur. They whispered to each other in Latin, their mouths curling in amusement or pity, it was hard to tell. One of them laughed when a Gothic elder bowed too deeply and fell to his knees. He called him dog under his breath. The translator softened it to guest. They called this a resettlement. But it was exile. In the nights, the Gothic women sang songs that belonged to no church. Melodies older than saints, carrying names that were never written down. Alarica's mother sang them low, just above a whisper, while she combed fingers through her daughter's hair. Her voice cracked like old bark. The song was not for comfort, but remembrance, a tether to a world vanishing with each breath. One night, a child disappeared. The next morning, they found her body near the river's edge. Her hands were blue, her lips still parted as if she had tried to speak one last word. No one said it aloud, but they all knew, she had gone looking for her father. He had drowned the week before, trying to fish through the ice. The Romans buried her without rites. Just a hole, a stone, and silence. And then came the sickness. It moved like wine through the camp, quick, invisible, cruel. Children fell first. Then the elders. Then the ones who had strength left to hope. Bodies piled near the river's edge, frozen too stiff to bury. The air reeked of death and unwashed fear. The priests blessed what they could. The rest was left to God. Alarica stopped speaking. She sat each day inside the broken chapel, fingers curled around her father's crucifix, her eyes locked on the raven that never left the beam. It watched her the way a priest might watch a sin. She began to imagine it was her brother, the one born with a limp, the one the Romans had taken for labor. She imagined his soul in the raven's eyes, warning her of something coming. Something worse. And it did come. The gates never opened. Rome had promised land, food, protection, a place in the empire. But winter came and went, and still the walls remained closed. Behind them, grain rotted in storage. Senators debated. Generals argued. The Goths waited. And starved. One day, a man named Fritigern stood before the Roman magistrate. He wore a cloak made of wolf pelts and a sword notched from too many battles. His face was gaunt. His voice was calm. He said, simply, "Open the gates. Or we will open them." The magistrate smiled. He offered wine and words. Fritigern did not drink. That night, a Roman merchant was found gutted near the camp. The next, a Gothic elder was beaten for stealing bread. And then came the fire. No one knows who started it. But when it rose, it swallowed the sky, black smoke curling like a funeral shroud across the Danube. The Roman garrison responded with blades. The Goths with stones, spears, and rage centuries in the making. Alarica watched from the chapel steps as the world shattered again. Her mother screamed her father's name and disappeared into the crowd. Children wailed. Horses broke their tethers and fled into the woods. Blood slicked the frozen earth, and the raven, her raven, took flight for the first time in days, circling high above the flames like a spirit loosed from the body. The rebellion had begun. Not in strategy, not in triumph, but in grief. In hunger. In memory. The Romans would call it a revolt. A betrayal. A warning. But to the Goths, it was something simpler. A beginning. For centuries they had circled the edges of empire, invited and despised, feared and exploited. Now, there would be no more begging. No more kneeling. Only fire. Alarica stood in the chapel doorway, the crucifix still clutched in her hand. The wood cracked. She looked down and saw that she had squeezed it so tightly, the brittle wood had split along the grain. A splinter pierced her palm. Blood welled, slow and dark. She did not cry. She stepped forward, into the ash. The raven circled once more overhead, then vanished into the smoke. And somewhere in the distance, beyond the trees, beyond the river, beyond even memory, a horn blew. Not for war. Not yet. But for something deeper. A reckoning. The firelight danced across her face as she walked into the wind. Behind her, the chapel burned. Ahead, the empire waited. Not with open arms. But with open wounds. And so began the long shadow. The slow march. Not of a people seeking glory, but of those who have nothing left to lose. Next would come battle. Betrayal. A city brought to its knees not by swords, but by hunger and ghosts. But that story, that begins with the breath of a dying emperor, in a field thick with vultures, the bell tolled once. Not for a death. Not yet. But for something else, a moment the city did not know how to name. In the half-light of dawn, Constantinople shivered. Fog moved like pale ghosts between columns of marble and shattered statues. Crows gathered along the cornices of old imperial forums, their wings restless, their calls jagged against the silence. And within the walls of the sacred palace, where emperors dined beneath ceilings that mirrored the constellations, a chamberlain stood frozen in the corridor. A silk curtain brushed his shoulder. Behind it, hidden from public gaze, the emperor sat dressed in gold. They were expecting a king. But not a king who smelled of firewood and leather. Not one whose hands bore calluses, whose eyes carried the weight of snow-covered graves. Outside the city, a procession waited. Silent. Still. More funeral than triumph. At its head was Athanaric. He dismounted without aid, his boots landing in the dust with a muffled thud. The cobbles of the imperial courtyard had never held feet like his, bare beneath the winter cloak, scarred from a lifetime on paths unpaved by empire. He did not look up at the domes or the mosaics. He did not admire the gates, or the holy icons embossed on the doors. He stared ahead, his breath curling in the cold. Athanaric had once been the nightmare of Rome, the judge of his people, chosen not by birthright but by fire, oath, and ordeal. He had led Gothic warriors through snow and blood, watched children freeze in his shadow, and buried wives whose names he no longer dared to speak aloud. And now he stood at the gates of the city he had once sworn never to enter. The emperor sent envoys. They bowed. Offered bread, wine, a procession of olive branches too late in season. Athanaric nodded, but said nothing. He was dying. They could all see it. The hollowness beneath his cheekbones. The way he moved, like wood that had nearly burned through. Illness clung to him like smoke from a battlefield long abandoned. Each breath rattled in his ribs, each step a gamble against time. But he had come here not for medicine. He had come to be seen. They led him through halls lit by golden lanterns. The air was thick with incense, and the floor was warm beneath his feet, a strange cruelty, for it reminded him of things too distant to reach again, the heat of a wife's hand, the comfort of dry straw, the steadiness of youth. He passed mosaics of Christ with jeweled halos, of martyrs in white, of saints who had never stepped beyond the gates of Rome. He paused beneath one, a figure with eyes made of glass and lips forever sealed in blessing. And Athanaric whispered, "You do not know my name. But I remember yours." In the throne room, the emperor waited. Draped in robes so heavy with embroidery they barely moved, he raised a hand in welcome. Around him stood bishops, generals, eunuchs, men who knew war by ink and decree. They watched Athanaric with a reverence reserved for dying stars. He did not kneel. The room held its breath. Instead, Athanaric bowed his head once, slowly, as one might lower a torch before extinguishing it. Not in submission, but in ritual. An offering of dignity. Then he looked into the emperor's eyes and said, in perfect Latin, "I have seen your empire in fire. I have seen it in famine. Now, let me see it in peace." A silence followed. Not one dared to interrupt it. The emperor rose. He stepped forward and took the Gothic king's hand. Their fingers touched, old flesh, both, wrapped in the weight of too many ghosts. They dined that night. Roasted lamb with rosemary. Bread laced with honey. Sour cherries soaked in wine. Athanaric ate little. He sat quietly, watching the room, the golden plates, the servants whose faces never lifted from the floor. He listened as bishops discussed theology, as senators praised the peace. He said nothing when they toasted his wisdom. His gaze lingered on a harpist in the corner, a girl with hands like birds. She played a melody older than the empire. He recognized it. But she would never know that he did. That night, alone in his chamber, he removed his cloak. The scars on his back spoke of older battles, not against Rome, but against time, and the betrayal of the body. He sat beside a small oil lamp and held a piece of bark in his hand. It was pine, carved with runes from the forest north of the Danube. He whispered into the flame. Not a prayer. Just a name. He died before the second bell. No one heard him fall. A servant found him seated upright, eyes half-lidded, mouth slightly parted, as if about to speak. In his lap lay the pine carving, and beside him, untouched, the imperial robe gifted to him upon his arrival. It shimmered with purple thread, heavy as gilt. The city awoke to mourning. But not of its own. A foreign king had passed in its heart, and with him went something else, a reckoning unspoken. They could not decide whether to call him enemy or guest. Pagan or convert. Conqueror or refugee. They buried him with Christian rites. A mosaic was commissioned in his name. A stone laid in his honor. But his sword, the one forged in Gothic fire, etched with the names of lost brothers, was never consecrated. It was placed beside him in the tomb, unsanctified. As he would have wished. In the basilica, a priest sang over his body in Latin. But in the alleyways of the city, Gothic children pressed reeds to their lips and played songs their mothers had taught them in whispers. And the raven returned. Perched on the stone lintel of the tomb, it cawed once, then flew north. The empire tried to remember him cleanly. As a man who laid down arms. As a symbol of peace. But time, like snow, buries all things crooked. And the truth remains beneath. Athanaric had not come to make peace. He had come to die in the sight of those who once called him shadow. He had come to leave a mark deeper than steel. And he had. In the years that followed, others would come, not to dine, but to burn. The Goths would return not as guests, but as ghosts clad in iron and grief. They would take cities, topple statues, and carve their stories into the heartwood of Rome's decaying tree. But not yet. For now, the city still believed in its walls. Still believed in its saints. Still believed that memory could be edited. That morning, the sky broke open in rain. Not the gentle kind, the kind that scrubs away names from stone, that drowns fires smoldering in distant hills. And somewhere, beyond the edge of empire, a boy crouched beneath a pine, holding a wooden figure to his chest, waiting for a father who would never return. The fire would reach him soon. But for a moment, the world was quiet. A king had died. And something older than empire stirred in the roots of the earth. The frost was thick enough to crack bone. In the gray of morning, before the crows began their bitter gossip, a boy crouched inside the hollow of a dead elm. His fingers bled where bark had split beneath them. His breath clouded the air, slow and shallow, as if exhaling too loudly might awaken something worse than wolves. Through the trees, they came. A slow, deliberate rhythm of movement. Not the chaos of a raiding band, nor the solemn pace of pilgrims, this was something older. Something heavier. Men moved like ghosts, wrapped in layered cloaks stitched from hide and threadbare linen, spears strapped to backs slick with ice. Their footsteps cracked frozen moss. Their silence said more than war cries ever could. They were Goths. And they were not marching for spoils. The boy's eyes found the man at the front. Taller than the others. Thinner. A scar cut through the shadow of his jaw. His cloak was ash-colored, hemmed in fur. No crown, no standard, no guards. Yet the air around him shifted. His name was Theoderic. Not yet the king of Italy, not yet the master of cities and treaties. Now, just a man born of a treaty himself, a hostage once bartered like wheat between worlds. He had lived inside Roman marble halls, bathed in gold bowls, spoken Latin at supper and Gothic in dreams. Now, he walked between those two selves. Neither Roman, nor wholly free. He did not speak as they moved. No orders. No prayers. The wind was their hymn. Behind him came men with braided beards and boys who had never held anything heavier than firewood. Grandfathers with joints carved by frost, and widows who carried the swords of their dead. No one called it an invasion. No one dared call it homecoming. They had crossed into Italy beneath a sky of burnished copper, clouds low enough to touch. Every tree they passed seemed to bow, or break. The roads were ancient, older than memory. Stones still bore the marks of imperial sandals. Mileposts leaned sideways, overgrown with ivy, as if ashamed to name cities now silent. Along the path lay remnants of a world asleep, shrines without offerings, wells long dry, farmhouses where vines crept through shattered windows. And yet, not entirely abandoned. In the doorways, figures appeared. Not soldiers. Not men of resistance. Farmers. Old women with smoke in their hair and dried herbs in their fists. Children whose eyes had forgotten how to trust. They stood barefoot in the cold, watching the Goths pass, not with hatred, but with a tired, aching curiosity. They had seen emperors come and go. They had paid taxes in wheat, in sons, in silence. And now, they saw in these men something strangely familiar. They saw the hunger in their faces. They saw the dirt beneath their nails. They saw that these were not devils. Not demons. Just people who had run too far, for too long. Theoderic dismounted only once, before a broken statue of Mars, its face worn to a smear by rain and time. He stared at it a moment. As if asking it a question. Then he turned and walked on. No one knew where exactly they were going. Only that Rome had fractured, not with a bang, but with a slow forgetting. Generals declared themselves emperors. Cities fortified themselves, not against barbarians, but against their neighbors. Laws grew thicker as justice grew thin. The world was unraveling. And into that unraveling stepped the Goths, not as invaders, but as a thread of continuity. They came not to destroy, but to remember. To stake claim to something older than borders. At night, the campfires flickered low. Meat was scarce. Bread was thin. Hope thinner. The boy from the elm had followed them. He had no name they would understand. No father to protect him. No reason to live, except that he had not yet died. He stole scraps from the ashes, drank melted snow from his cupped hands. No one stopped him. One night, as the fire cracked soft and low, Theoderic looked at the boy. He did not speak. But he handed him a cloth, a strip of wool, wrapped around a bit of dried meat. The boy hesitated. Then took it. And in that exchange passed more than food. A silence of recognition. Of shared shadow. Theoderic's eyes were tired, but not cold. He remembered being hungry. He remembered hiding from men who spoke his name as a threat. And perhaps, somewhere in him, he remembered being the boy. The next morning, word reached them, a Roman outpost abandoned. No battle. No warning. The soldiers had simply left. Theoderic walked through its gate. The walls were covered in mold. Shields lay in corners like discarded toys. A chapel stood with its doors ajar, candles still burned low on the altar. He touched one. Still warm. And in the center of the floor, scattered like dropped prayers, were pages, scripture torn by wind, ink running like veins across the marble. He knelt and gathered one, pressing it between his fingers. Not out of piety. But remembrance. He had once read such things in a Roman court. Heard them spoken in voices smooth as honey, full of power. Now they lay here, trampled and fading. He did not burn the place. He left it as he found it, as a monument to forgetting. As they moved further south, the weather softened. Frost gave way to mist. The land grew rich again. Vineyards, once tended by hands now cold, bore wild grapes. The rivers thickened with silt and memory. But peace did not follow. A Roman patrol arrived one morning. They rode with polished armor and hungry eyes. A young commander, noble-born, rode to meet Theoderic beneath the banner of a white cloth. He offered terms. Theoderic listened. Then said only, "Too late." The skirmish was brief. Steel rang against steel. A horse screamed. Blood soaked into loam, warm and fast. The boy from the elm watched from behind a cart. He saw Theoderic's blade arc through sunlight, saw the Roman's face crumple like wet paper. He did not cheer. No one did. Victory was not a word they spoke. Only survival. When it was over, the Gothic dead were buried with stones on their eyes, to weigh the soul, to keep it from wandering. The Romans were burned. Not in hate. But because the land refused to keep them. Later, as the sun dipped low, Theoderic stood alone by a stream. The water ran clear, but something in him had gone murky. He had led his people not to glory, but to another war. He had inherited a crown of ash. Yet behind him, children laughed. Not many. Not loud. But enough. They played near the fire, drawing shapes in the mud, swords, suns, animals from dreams. One of them gave the boy from the elm a new name. Something soft, something born from the sound of wind through trees. He smiled, just once. And for a moment, the world felt like it might be worth saving. Far away, Rome still sat, wounded, prideful, flickering. It would not fall in a single blow. It would fall like a dying fire, ember by ember, whisper by whisper. But Theoderic would go to it. Not with torches. But with memory. And the next chapter would not be written in fields, or forests, but in marble halls, where ghosts of emperors still lingered in the dust, and shadows stretched long over throne rooms built for gods. And in that silence, he would ask the oldest question, what makes a kingdom? And more dangerously, a scream cut through the mist, sharp, guttural, and short. Then silence. Not the quiet of peace, but the suffocating kind. The kind that falls after blood is spilled and before breath dares to return. Birds did not stir. Trees did not creak. Even the wind seemed to hold its tongue. In the dim glow of morning, a village smoldered. Thatched roofs sagged under the weight of smoke, wood split and charred like bones beneath fire. Livestock roamed untethered, eyes wide, ribs visible beneath torn hides. A woman knelt near the ashes of a chapel, whispering prayers into hands blackened with soot, not because she believed someone would answer, but because her tongue knew no other shape. She had seen them come. Roman soldiers, but not the ones of marble statues and silver eagles. These were men grown desperate, mercenaries in rusted armor, blades dulled by too many betrayals. They no longer fought for empire. They fought for bread, for coin, for the right to be feared. And this time, it had been the village of Ravenna. The city itself still stood behind its marshy walls, but the outlying settlements, the places that fed it, clothed it, bled for it, were left exposed. That was where the scream had come from. From a child, dragged from his home by men who spoke Latin through broken teeth. His mother had fought, and was thrown into the fire she once cooked over. The boy had not screamed again. Word of the slaughter reached Theoderic before the embers cooled. He stood at the edge of a ridge, looking down at the smoke curling like snakes into the sky. His men waited behind him, not for orders, but for his breath. They had followed him through mountain snow, across the ruins of forgotten temples, through hunger and ghosts and endless waiting. But now they needed fire. Now they needed purpose. Theoderic did not weep. His face was carved from something harder than grief. He said only one thing, no more. And then they moved. Not with fanfare. Not with banners or horns. But with the cold precision of men who knew what had been taken, and what must be taken back. The road to Ravenna was wet with summer rot. Flies clung to everything. The rivers swelled with the heat, and frogs sang songs of warning no one could understand. Yet the Goths moved like shadows through it all, deliberate, steady, unyielding. They passed another village, this one empty. But not silent. Doors creaked open without wind. Plates still sat on tables, bread molded, wine soured. In the barn, a cross had been scrawled in blood across a beam. It was not a holy symbol. It was a warning, this is what the empire protects. Theoderic entered the house at the village center. Dust clung to the beams. A baby's swaddling cloth lay crumpled beside a cradle. The silence was so thick it felt like drowning. He picked up the cloth, stared at it for a moment. Then wrapped it around his sword hilt. A vow. Not for vengeance alone, but to carve something cleaner from the rot. They reached the edge of Ravenna at dusk. The city floated between land and sea, its marshes treacherous and its walls tall. It had once been a jewel, seat of emperors, gate of the west. Now it was a fortress of whispers. Inside, Odoacer still ruled, or pretended to. He had worn the title of king since the empire fractured, a general who filled a vacuum left by cowards. But the people did not sing his name. They spoke it in taverns with curses or not at all. He had become a man of walls, not roads. And Theoderic was a man of roads. That night, Theoderic did not sleep. He sat beside the fire with a scroll in his hands, a letter, sealed and then broken. It bore the mark of Constantinople. The emperor of the East had named him Patricius, had promised him Italy in exchange for order. But what was a title if the land still burned? What was power, if it was granted by those who never touched the soil? One of his captains approached, his face lined with mud and fatigue. The scouts returned, he said. There are weaknesses in the southern marsh. We can press them hard. Theoderic nodded, then looked at the boy who now served him, the same child who had once watched from the hollow of a tree. He had grown, if only in scars. What do you see when you look at this place? Theoderic asked him. The boy hesitated. Then said, a city that forgot how to be alive. Theoderic smiled, a bitter, broken thing. And then, at dawn, they moved again. Not in fury. In silence. Through the marshes, they crept, one by one, like revenants through the mist. The reeds reached for their ankles, the mud sucked at their boots. The towers above loomed like watchers, but the sentries were thin and tired. The first blow fell with the sound of a bell cracking. Then came the shouting. Steel on stone. Fire. The walls held, but barely. And inside, panic spread faster than flames. Odoacer rallied his troops with the bark of an old wolf. He rode through the city, promising defense, promising justice, promising death to the invaders. But his people did not believe him. They remembered the taxes. The broken oaths. The soldiers who took more than they protected. And when Theoderic's voice rang out over the walls, open your gates. Or burn with your tyrant. Some wondered if this was the voice of a savior. Others, simply hoped for change. The siege lasted weeks. Each day, the city lost a little more of itself. Wells dried. Grain spoiled. Hope thinned. Odoacer grew silent. Inside his palace, he paced. He remembered when Rome had feared him. When generals had bowed. When the East had acknowledged his crown, if only with gritted teeth. And now they sent him a barbarian with perfect Latin and a Roman seal. It was treachery. It was fate. It was the end. The gates finally opened on a cold morning without sun. Theoderic entered the city not as a conqueror, but as a shadow, quiet, tall, eyes forward. His sword was still wrapped in the swaddling cloth. He passed through streets that did not cheer, but did not resist. And then, he came to the palace. Odoacer waited beneath a crumbling mosaic of Jupiter, his crown dull, his robe stained. For a moment, they simply looked at each other. One man forged in power. The other in exile. You were never meant to rule, Theoderic said. Odoacer answered, and yet I did. For 10 years. There was no ceremony. No trial. No final prayer. Theoderic raised his blade. And with one stroke, ended an era. The silence after was not peace. It was breath, deep, long, hesitant. The city did not erupt. The people did not dance. They simply exhaled. Later, Theoderic walked alone through the city's heart. He passed churches that still smelled of incense, markets now quiet, streets where blood had dried in the cracks. He stopped before the great baptistry, where sunlight spilled through colored glass. There, in that sacred hush, he sat. Not as king. Not yet. But as a man who had taken back what was stolen, not for glory, but for memory. For every village burned, every name forgotten, every whisper smothered. And in that stained light, he whispered, "We are not the end of Rome. We are what it left behind." The boy stood beside him now. He said nothing. But in his hand, he held the cloth. And in his silence, the future began. The city was his now, but the story was far from over. For the East still watched. And what they had granted, they could still take away. And in the East, thrones did not rest easy. Not with Theoderic seated on one. A candle flickered in a room where no wind moved. The air was too still, thick with the scent of old oil, sweat, and something heavier, the anticipation of betrayal. The flame danced as if trying to speak, but all it could whisper was the tremble of silence. Beneath that sickly glow, Theoderic sat alone. Not in the halls of his enemies, nor on a battlefield strewn with corpses. But in a Roman villa, newly his, deeply foreign. Marble columns rose around him like the ribs of a beast long dead, and on the walls, faded mosaics showed gods no longer prayed to. He was king now. But the weight of the crown was invisible, and crushing. Outside, Ravenna stirred cautiously. Markets reopened with whispers. Guards patrolled not as tyrants, but as watchers. The people looked at Theoderic with wide eyes, not in awe, but in wonder. Would he be different? Would he remember their hunger? Their silence? Their dead? He had killed Odoacer with his own hand, not on a field, but at a banquet. A promise of peace shattered with a dagger beneath the ribs. A single red flower blooming on white tunic. Some called it justice. Others, murder. But Theoderic had not flinched. He knew what Rome required now, not compromise, but clarity. No more half-rulers. No more shadows on the throne. Either he would hold Italy, or he would be buried beneath it. Still, the echoes remained. Odoacer's men had not all vanished. Some had melted into the hills, others waited in the alleys, eyes sharp, hands near blades. Resistance did not wear banners. It wore patience. One morning, they found a body in the forum, one of Theoderic's new magistrates. Stripped, throat slit, a coin placed on each eye. A message. Rome remembers. Rome resists. But Theoderic did not reply with executions. He replied with order. Courts reopened. Roads were cleared of bandits. Aqueducts began to flow again. Grain shipments resumed, not just to nobles, but to the hungry. He walked the streets without an entourage, letting the dust cling to his boots. The people noticed. In the basilicas, he allowed Latin prayers and Gothic oaths alike. Bishops bowed, unsure if they did so out of habit or fear. He touched no altar, claimed no divine right. His authority came not from heaven, but from iron, memory, and vision. Still, he knew it was not enough. Not yet. The empire to the east, Constantinople, the second Rome, watched with eagle eyes. Zeno was dead. Anastasius now wore the diadem. And he had not yet decided if Theoderic was a tool, or a threat. So Theoderic wrote letters. Not as a vassal. As a partner. He spoke of stability. Of cooperation. Of unity between peoples who bled the same, though they prayed in different tongues. But the East did not forget. They remembered the Goths' old raids. The chaos. The blood in the snow. And behind courtly phrases and wax seals, they prepared. Theoderic knew this. He read it in the lines between words. He heard it in the delay of replies. He saw it in the diplomats who smiled too wide. So he did what only a ruler born in exile could do. He began to build a kingdom that could outlive suspicion. He appointed Roman senators to high office, men whose fathers had once spat at his people. He let them wear togas, speak Cicero's Latin, argue in marble halls. But beneath it all, Gothic steel watched. And yet, it was not fear that held the new kingdom together. It was rhythm. Roman roads, Gothic swords. Roman law, Gothic loyalty. Roman grain, Gothic hands to till the earth. He called it unity. Some called it something else, an illusion. A compromise. A dream walking too close to the edge of a blade. One evening, a storm broke over Ravenna. Rain fell like judgment, hard and cold. Thunder cracked like ancient gods waking from their sleep. And in the dark, a rider came, soaked, breathless, bearing news from the north. Rebellion. A Roman noble, ignited by pride and Eastern gold, had raised his banner. Claimed to restore the old Senate. Called Theoderic a usurper, a barbarian dressed in Roman silk. Theoderic said nothing at first. He looked out at the lightning over the marshes. Listened to the storm. Then, quietly, he gave the order. Ride. His men moved like wolves. Silent. Swift. The rebellion did not last a week. When it ended, the nobleman was brought before him, bound, bloodied, still defiant. You think you can make Rome Gothic, he spat. Theoderic did not raise his voice. No, he said. I think I can make Rome live. Then he turned away. Left the man to face justice, not by sword, but by court. Even punishment, now, had to be lawful. He was not building an empire of vengeance. He was building something stranger, a world where former enemies sat at the same table, where language could be divided but peace shared, where tradition was respected, but not worshipped. It was fragile. It was bold. It was dangerous. And it was working. In the years that followed, the roads of Italy became safer than they had been in a century. Trade returned. Art flourished. Children born under his reign grew up never having known Roman emperors, only Theoderic. But the East still watched. And every gesture of peace was a calculation. Every letter a negotiation. In Constantinople, Anastasius had begun to whisper of heresy, that Theoderic, an Arian, corrupted the faith. That his tolerance masked a deeper poison. That a true Roman could not kneel before a man baptized in a barbarian creed. And so, as churches in the East burned those who prayed differently, Theoderic walked into the basilica in Ravenna and laid a single stone. For a new church. Not Gothic. Not Roman. Christian. And above its doorway, he had a mosaic set. Not of Christ crowned in gold, but of peace offered by two hands, one pale, one dark, holding the same olive branch. When it was unveiled, the people stood in silence. And some wept. It was not just mortar and paint. It was defiance, wrapped in beauty. But peace cannot be painted into permanence. Even as Italy bloomed, old fractures widened beneath the surface. Whispers returned. Not from without, but from within. Theoderic's own court began to split. Senators loyal to Rome resented the Gothic Guard. Gothic nobles feared dilution by Roman law. And his heir, Amalasuntha's son, was still a boy, eyes wide with books but not yet steel. Theoderic grew older. Not in weakness, but in weight. He walked slower. Thought longer. Slept less. And one night, alone in his garden, he looked up at the stars, the same stars he had once watched as a child in a tent beyond the Danube. He did not pray. He remembered. And he whispered, I have built something I cannot hold. Behind him, the wind moved through olive trees. Soft. Inevitable. Far to the east, another candle flickered in a palace. And this one did not go out. A raven landed on the stone wall of the mausoleum before dawn. Its claws scraped the moss-covered edge, and its eyes, black and glistening, watched the torches below as they flickered and died in the wind. Inside, the king was dying. Theoderic, once the conqueror of Italy, lay wrapped in silence. Not the silence of peace, but the waiting stillness of legacy. His breath was shallow. His fingers, once curled around the hilts of war, now trembled when they touched parchment. He had ruled with discipline, with calculation, with a vision born of exile and war. But now, at the edge of life, that vision blurred, washed away by the slow, cold pull of time. They called it fever. But it wasn't illness alone. It was the weight of betrayal. Of disappointment. Of a dream outpacing the hands that had shaped it. He had tried to build something the world had never seen, an empire not bound by bloodline or creed, but by coexistence. Romans and Goths. Pagans and Christians. Soldiers and scholars. One realm, one law, held not by force, but by trust. And now, he saw the cracks. He had outlived too many. Boethius, once his closest advisor, the last Roman philosopher, had died in chains. Accused of treason. Condemned without trial. Theoderic had signed the order himself. Not out of rage, but fear. That the East was turning the Senate against him. That loyalty was a mask, and every friend might be a blade. But as Boethius screamed into the cold prison walls, truth still exists, even when forgotten. Theoderic felt the first tremor in the kingdom he thought he'd mastered. He had built peace with steel and compromise. But peace built on fear is a coin with blood on both sides. Now, as he lay beneath linen soaked in his own sweat, visions came. Not of glory. But of ghosts. He saw Odoacer, kneeling at that banquet. The shock in his eyes. The blood bubbling from his lips. He saw Roman senators bowing, not in respect, but in calculation. He saw the East, silent, watching, waiting. And he saw his own granddaughter, Amalasuntha, pacing the marble halls like a lioness in a cage. Brilliant. Proud. Too Roman for the Goths. Too Gothic for the Romans. She would inherit what he had made. And perhaps, she would be torn apart by it. The physicians whispered behind heavy doors. Incantations were muttered. Prayers offered in both Latin and Gothic tongues. But no hand could hold back what was coming. The torch of twilight had been passed to a trembling horizon. And outside, the city slowed. In Ravenna, the bells tolled not for mourning, but for uncertainty. The people remembered the famine years. The years of chaos. And they looked now toward the palace not with reverence, but with a creeping dread, who would hold the reins next. Amalasuntha was clever. Educated. She had read every Roman text her grandfather preserved. She quoted Cicero like a bishop quotes scripture. She dreamed of a kingdom ruled by law, not blades. But she was a woman. And to many in the Gothic nobility, that meant weakness. Theoderic knew this. He had watched the way they looked at her, too long, too silently. He had tried to protect her. Given her power early. Let her rule beside him. Let her voice be law. But it was not enough. The wolves were already circling. He had thought legacy was a monument. Now he knew it was a thread, fraying with each heartbeat. On the last night, a thunderstorm rolled over the Adriatic. Lightning painted the sea like broken glass. And in the palace garden, where once he had walked in strength, Theoderic asked to be taken, one final time. They carried him beneath the cypress trees, wrapped in wool and silence. And there, with eyes half clouded by pain, he whispered not to his guards or his priests, but to the trees. Let them remember. I tried. No marble ever carved that phrase. No chronicler wrote it. But the wind heard it. And when he died, just before dawn, the raven took flight from the mausoleum wall and vanished into the fog. The kingdom mourned. But not as it once would have. Some wept. Some waited. Some began to whisper. Amalasuntha took the regency with poise. She ruled not by decree, but by letter. Her words, flowing in ink, traveled farther than swords. She opened schools. Translated Greek texts into Latin. Invited Roman jurists to her court. Reformed taxes. Tamed corruption. And the common people, those who had lived too long beneath storms, began to hope. But hope is a dangerous currency. The Gothic nobles, bred on war and hierarchy, looked at her policies with disdain. They called her Roman behind her back. Soft. Corrupted. They did not say it to her face. She was, after all, Theoderic's blood. But blood thins when the crown grows heavy. She sent her son to be educated in Constantinople, among the Byzantines, the enemies. She believed knowledge was the future's shield. The Goths saw it as betrayal. One morning, a noble approached her court unannounced. He bowed. He smiled. And he left behind a dead servant on the palace floor. A message, carved into the boy's chest: Rome cannot birth a Gothic queen. Amalasuntha said nothing. Not in public. But that night, the fires in the barracks burned late. And 2 weeks later, that same noble was found hanged. No witnesses. No trial. Only a rope, a silence, and a kingdom drawing its breath. She ruled on. But the shadow of Theoderic, his dream, his fear, his empire stitched with paradox, stretched over every room. And far to the east, in Constantinople, Emperor Justinian stirred. He watched Italy with cold ambition. He saw a kingdom ruled by a woman, fractured by identity, ripe with internal betrayal. And he began to plan. Not invasion. Restoration. He would reclaim the West, not for glory, but for God. Not as conqueror, but as rightful heir. The Roman world, broken in half for a century, would become whole again, under Eastern hands. He summoned generals. Built ships. Drafted proclamations. And in the dark, as Ravenna slept beneath its painted stars, Amalasuntha dreamed of books and bridges, unaware that war was already crossing the sea. The marble floors were cold that morning. Not from weather, but from something older, heavier. As if the stone itself had absorbed the silence of centuries, and now exhaled it in chill waves through the halls of Ravenna. Amalasuntha stood alone before the mosaic of her father. Gold tiles shimmered behind the stern gaze of Theoderic the Great, immortalized in a cloak of conquest. His hand extended outward, not in blessing, not in threat, but in that strange gesture emperors preferred, power suspended between mercy and control. She whispered to the image. You left me a crown, and a curse. The empire he built was crumbling, not with fire or siege, but from within. A quiet unraveling. The threads of identity, Roman and Gothic, pagan and Christian, East and West, had frayed into something ungovernable. She had tried. Tried to bind it together with law, learning, and clemency. But the very tools that once built Rome were now used as weapons against her. To the Romans, she was too barbarian. To the Goths, too Roman. To both, too woman. And somewhere in the folds of power, truth vanished. Her son, her heir, remained far away in Constantinople, where she had sent him to learn civility, diplomacy, philosophy. But in his absence, the court grew restless. The Gothic nobles whispered in mead halls, their voices thick with suspicion. She weakens us, they said. She speaks in Latin, not Gothic. She would rather quote Aristotle than raise a sword. They did not remember the famine years. Or the plagues. Or the way Theoderic's peace had kept their children fed and their enemies at bay. They only saw a woman on a throne they did not believe she deserved. And so, the plot began. A quiet thing. A shadowed thing. It did not begin with blades, but with smiles. One of the Gothic lords, Theodahad, a man of noble blood and oily charm, came to her side. He spoke with courtesy. Offered allegiance. Flattered her wisdom. Asked her counsel on land disputes and military appointments. He was a serpent draped in civility. She, desperate for unity, reached for his outstretched hand. Together, they would co-rule. A compromise, she thought. A bridge between fire and parchment. But Theodahad had no love for vision. No loyalty to the legacy she bled to uphold. He wanted the throne. And she had just invited him to it. Not weeks passed before the shift. Guards she trusted were dismissed. Letters intercepted. Allies vanished into exile, or silence. And then, without warning, she was seized. No outcry. No trial. No protest from the Senate. She was a queen in name only, now a prisoner on the island of Lake Bolsena, held in a villa surrounded by water, as if isolation itself could erase her memory. The wind howled across the lake like a morning chorus. She wrote letters. To Constantinople. To old friends in Rome. To her son. But no answer came. Only the sound of waves lapping against stone. Day after day. Then, the final silence. One morning, as sunlight broke across the water in fractured gold, her maids found her lifeless. No blood. No bruises. No wound to blame. Only a bowl of wine, and the faintest scent of hemlock. Some say it was suicide. Others, murder. Whispers traveled faster than the wind. Theodahad had claimed her crown, and her death. And in Constantinople, those whispers grew into thunder. Amalasuntha had been an ally of the East. A defender of Roman order. A bridge to reunification. Her murder was not just a crime, it was a message. To Justinian, the emperor of the East, it was a challenge. A dare. He would answer not with words, but with war. The war to reclaim the West. He turned to his general, the one whose name would echo through centuries. Belisarius. Young. Brilliant. Merciless when needed. Loyal to Justinian above all else. And so, in secret, a fleet was prepared. Not ragged bands of raiders, but a force clad in discipline, forged by ambition. 10,000 men. Ships stretching across the Aegean like wings of vengeance. They sailed not for plunder. But to restore what had been lost. To avenge a queen drowned in silence. To bring Roman law back to Roman soil. And so began the Gothic War. A war that would shatter cities. Break kingdoms. And paint the Italian soil with ash and memory. But on that first night, when Belisarius stepped ashore in Sicily, he looked not toward battle. He looked toward Ravenna. Toward the mosaic of a queen no longer breathing. And he whispered, under his breath, a single oath, I will finish what you could not. And the wind carried it, westward, toward the grave that once held a dream.